Strategic high ground in eastern Ukraine, contested territory since the 2022 Russian invasion. Early morning, temperature -10°C, light snowfall, a hill rising from surrounding Ukrainian farmland, not particularly tall, but tactically significant. From summit, Russian forces could direct artillery fire across kilometers of Ukrainian terrain and control Ukrainian road network below. Ukrainian defensive position held the summit. 80 Ukrainian soldiers in prepared trenches and bunkers. 4 Ukrainian anti-tank positions. 2 Ukrainian mortars. Ukrainian forces had occupied this ground for weeks, improving positions, watching Russian movements in Ukrainian lowlands. Russian command decided the position needed to be eliminated. High ground in Ukrainian hands was unacceptable to Russian operations. Taking it would deny Ukrainians observation and provide Russian forces that same advantage over Ukrainian territory. Russian assault force was assembled. 480 Russian soldiers, oversized Russian battalion, 12 Russian T-72B3 tanks for breakthrough power, 16 Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles carrying Russian assault troops, Russian command element, Russian engineers, Russian medical support, Russian logistics. Everything Russian forces needed for deliberate assault on Ukrainian fortified position. A Russian colonel commanded the assault. Career Russian officer, experienced in combat operations, he planned methodically. Russian artillery preparation to suppress Ukrainian defenders. Russian tanks to lead assault against Ukrainian positions, using armor and firepower to break Ukrainian resistance. Russian infantry following to clear Ukrainian trenches and secure summit. Standard Russian combined arms attack. At 0530, 18 Russian 102mm artillery pieces began firing at Ukrainian positions. 360 Russian shells over 20 minutes. Ukrainian summit was covered in Russian explosions and smoke. Ukrainian defenders took direct Russian hits. Some Ukrainian soldiers died. Others sheltered deep in Ukrainian bunkers. Russian bombardment was heavy but not overwhelming against Ukrainian positions. At 0550, Russian assault began. 12 Russian tanks moved toward southern slope, steepest approach but most direct toward Ukrainian positions. Behind Russian tanks, 16 Russian BMPs carried assault infantry. Russian plan was hit Ukrainian positions hard on one side, overwhelm Ukrainian defenders quickly, take position from Ukrainian forces before they could react or request Ukrainian reinforcements. Ukrainian defenders engaged with available weapons. 2 Ukrainian Javelin missiles fired at Russian armor. 1 missed. Russian tank deployed countermeasures. Ukrainian missile decoyed away. Second Ukrainian hit Russian tank number 5 squarely on turret. Ukrainian tandem warhead punched through, detonated inside Russian tank. Russian ammunition ignited. Russian tank became fireball. 3 Russian crew died instantly, but 11 Russian tanks continued advancing against Ukrainian positions, firing main guns and machine guns at Ukrainian trenches. Russian BMPs added 30mm cannon fire on Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian defensive position was suppressed by Russian firepower. Ukrainian defenders who tried fighting were hit by overwhelming Russian firepower. Ukrainian soldiers who stayed in cover survived but couldn't stop Russian assault. By 0700, Russian forces reached Ukrainian summit. Close combat ensued. Russian infantry clearing Ukrainian trenches and bunkers. Ukrainian defenders fought hard, but were outnumbered and outgunned by Russian assault force. After 30 minutes fighting against Russian troops, Ukrainian survivors withdrew. Ukrainian forces had lost approximately 35 killed and wounded. Ukrainian troops retreated in good order, moving north off position held by Ukraine and disappearing into Ukrainian countryside. The Russian colonel stood on newly captured summit as his Russian soldiers consolidated. 1 Russian tank destroyed by Ukrainian Javelin, 2 Russian BMPs damaged by Ukrainian fire, 12 Russian soldiers killed, 18 Russian wounded. Russian operation had gone well from Russian perspective. Position was taken from Ukrainian forces. Russian colonel immediately ordered defensive preparations. Russian forces dig in, establish all-around security, wait for Russian reinforcements and Russian supplies. Russian battalions spread across summit and slopes. Southern slope, the side Russian forces had come up, got 4 Russian tanks, 6 Russian BMPs, 120 Russian soldiers. Northern slope got 3 Russian tanks, 4 Russian BMPs, 90 Russian men. Eastern and western slopes each got 2 Russian tanks, 3 Russian BMPs, 80 Russian soldiers. Reserve on summit, remaining Russian tanks and 110 Russian soldiers, including Russian command, Russian engineers, Russian medical. What the Russian colonel didn't know was that Ukrainian withdrawal had been planned. Ukrainian garrison was never meant to hold position indefinitely against superior Russian forces. Ukrainian mission was make Russians pay for taking it, then withdraw. Real Ukrainian operations started now. Ukrainian forces had been moving into position around the hill even as Russian assault occurred. 3 separate Ukrainian groups approaching from north, east, west. Large Ukrainian forces, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, dozens of Ukrainian vehicles, Ukrainian artillery support. Pre-positioned Ukrainian forces waiting for Russians to commit before closing trap. Northern Ukrainian group was largest. 18 Ukrainian T-64BV tanks, 2 full Ukrainian tank companies. 12 Ukrainian BMPs carrying Ukrainian mechanized infantry. 120 Ukrainian infantry total. Ukrainian artillery support. Battery of 6 Ukrainian 152 mm howitzers positioned 8 kilometers rear. This Ukrainian force designed to hit Russian rear, cutting off Russian retreat. Eastern Ukrainian group had 10 Ukrainian BMPs, 100 Ukrainian infantry, 8 Ukrainian Javelin missile teams, 4 Ukrainian 120 mm mortars. Western Ukrainian group similar, 10 Ukrainian BMPs, 112 Ukrainian infantry, 6 Ukrainian ATGM teams, 4 Ukrainian mortars. These Ukrainian forces would attack Russian flanks simultaneously. Southern approach, route Russians used to assault Ukrainian position, was being blocked by Ukrainian mine-laying teams and small Ukrainian diversionary groups. Not solid Ukrainian defense, but enough to channel any Russian breakout into Ukrainian killing zones. At 0830, Ukrainian counterattack began. 6 Ukrainian 152 mm howitzers opened fire on Russian summit position. Ukrainian guns were 12 kilometers away, firing from covered Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian artillery could shoot and move before Russian counter-battery arrived. First Ukrainian salvo of 6 shells landed across Russian summit. 1 Ukrainian shell struck near Russian command post the colonel established in ruins of old farm structure. 43-kilogram Ukrainian projectile came through partial roof, detonated inside Russian headquarters. 2 Russian officers died immediately. Russian colonel was thrown against wall by Ukrainian blast, suffered leg wound from Ukrainian fragments, but survived. Over 30 minutes, 120 Ukrainian shells fired at Russian positions. Russian summit became moonscape of fresh Ukrainian craters. 2 Russian BMPs destroyed by direct Ukrainian hits. 3 more Russian BMPs damaged. 1 Russian supply truck hit and destroyed by Ukrainian artillery. 23 Russian soldiers killed by Ukrainian bombardment. 34 Russian wounded. The Russian colonel, bleeding from leg wound caused by Ukrainian shrapnel, realized what was happening. Ukrainian forces weren't just harassing. This was Ukrainian preparation for assault. He radioed Russian headquarters. Under heavy Ukrainian artillery, observation indicates Ukrainian forces maneuvering around position. Request immediate Russian reinforcements and Russian air support. Russian response was not encouraging. Russian reinforcements will arrive in 4 to 5 hours. Russian aviation grounded due weather. Russian artillery support available, but limited. Hold your position against Ukrainian attack. At 0900, Ukrainian artillery ceased. The Russian colonel used POWs to assess Russian situation. Russian forces were spread around entire perimeter. Russian ammunition expenditure had been heavy during initial assault on Ukrainian position. Russian supply was limited, enough for attack on Ukrainians in initial defense, but not sustained combat against Ukrainian counterattack. Russian medical supplies already stretched by Russian wounded from Ukrainian artillery. At 0905, Northern Ukrainian group attacked Russian position. 18 Ukrainian tanks advancing on northern slope held by Russians, supported by 12 Ukrainian BMPs full of Ukrainian infantry. Against Ukrainian assault, 3 Russian tanks, 4 Russian BMPs, 90 Russian soldiers. Tank combat determined by who sees first, shoots first, hits first. Attacking Ukrainian tanks had numerical advantage and were attacking Russian positions Ukrainians had already scouted. Russian tank number 8 fired first at Ukrainian forces at 1,800 meters, scored hit on Ukrainian tank, but didn't penetrate Ukrainian frontal armor. Ukrainian return fire came from multiple Ukrainian tanks at Russian position. Russian tank 8 was hit 3 times by Ukrainian fire in 10 seconds. Third Ukrainian hit penetrated Russian turret, detonated Russian ammunition, killed Russian crew. Other 2 Russian tanks on northern slope fought desperately against Ukrainian assault, but were overwhelmed by Ukrainian numbers. Russian tank 6 destroyed by Ukrainian flank shot. Russian tank 10 took Ukrainian hit disabling main gun, then multiple Ukrainian hits setting Russian tank on fire. All 3 Russian crews died fighting Ukrainian forces. 4 Russian BMPs fired Konkurs anti-tank missiles at Ukrainian assault. 1 Russian missile hit, destroying attacking Ukrainian tank, but Ukrainian force was too large for Russian defenders. Ukrainian return fire destroyed 2 Russian BMPs, damaged others. 90 Russian infantry fought from trenches against Ukrainian assault, but were being pushed back by Ukrainian artillery and advancing Ukrainian infantry. Simultaneously, Eastern Ukrainian group attacked Russian position. 10 Ukrainian BMPs and 100 Ukrainian infantry, supported by 8 Ukrainian Javelin teams. Russian Eastern Slope defense, 2 Russian tanks, 3 Russian BMPs, 80 Russian men. Ukrainian Javelin teams were positioned in good firing positions, with clear lines of sight at Russian armor. Launched 8 Ukrainian missiles in rapid sequence at Russian targets. Russian Tank 3 took Ukrainian top attack hit through turret roof. Russian crew killed. Russian Tank 9 hit by Ukrainian missile inside. Penetration, fire. Russian crew evacuated. Russian BMP 12 hit by Ukrainian missile in rear. Ammunition detonation killed all Russian soldiers inside. Russian BMP 8 hit by Ukrainian missile in engine, immobilized. 2 minutes, Russian Eastern Slope lost all armor to Ukrainian assault. Russian infantry tried holding against Ukrainian forces, but faced superior Ukrainian numbers with Ukrainian fire support. Western Ukrainian group attacked Russian Western Slope same time. Similar pattern. 6 Ukrainian ATGM teams engaged and destroyed 2 Russian tanks defending that sector. Russian BMPs were hit by Ukrainian fire. Russian infantry under pressure from Ukrainian artillery and advancing Ukrainian troops. The Russian colonel watched from summit as all 3 Russian flank positions collapsed within 30 minutes under Ukrainian assault. Russian forces being compressed onto hilltop by Ukrainian attack. He still had 3 Russian tanks on summit, 7 Russian BMPs, but Russian infantry scattered, many Russian wounded, Russian ammunition running low. Russian colonel tried organizing Russian counterattack to break out south away from Ukrainian forces, gathered 60 Russian soldiers and 3 Russian BMPs, led by last operational Russian tank, number 11. Russian plan was punch through whatever Ukrainian forces blocked southern route and escape before being completely surrounded by Ukrainian forces. At 10:35, Russian breakout attempt began. Russian Tank 11 led, Russian BMPs following, Russian infantry running alongside. Russian forces made it 200 meters down slope. Russian Tank 11 drove over Ukrainian anti-tank mine. Ukrainian engineers had planted hours earlier in anticipation of Russian breakout. Explosions severed Russian track, immobilized Russian tank. Within seconds, Ukrainian Javelin missile hit Russian tank from concealed Ukrainian position. Russian tank exploded. Russian breakout stalled. 3 Russian BMPs tried continuing against Ukrainian positions, but were engaged by pre-positioned Ukrainian forces. 2 Russian BMPs destroyed by Ukrainian fire. 3rd Russian BMP turned back. 60 Russian infantry caught in open under Ukrainian mortar fire. 34 Russian soldiers killed by Ukrainian mortars. 18 Russian wounded. Remaining Russian soldiers retreated back to summit under Ukrainian fire. By 1100 hours, the Russian colonel's situation was desperate against Ukrainian encirclement. Russian forces confined to summit, mostly open ground. No Russian tanks operational after Ukrainian assault. 4 Russian BMPs still functional, but low on ammunition. 218 Russian soldiers combat effective. 87 Russian wounded. many seriously. Ukrainian forces occupied positions all around at 400 to 600 meters distance. Ukrainian forces had Russians surrounded, outnumbered, and were methodically destroying Russian position with Ukrainian artillery and direct fire. At 11:15, Ukrainian tanks moved closer and began direct fire on Russian summit. Any Russian vehicle, any Russian position identified was engaged by Ukrainian fire. Russian BMP-14 hit by Ukrainian tank round and exploded. Group of Russian soldiers trying to treat Russian wounded in ruins were killed when Ukrainian shell brought down remaining walls. Russian ammunition nearly exhausted after Ukrainian assault. Russian medical supplies gone. Russian medical team using torn Russian uniforms for bandages. Water running out. Temperature -10 and Russian soldiers getting cold as day wore on under Ukrainian fire. At 11:45, the Russian colonel radioed Russian headquarters again. Situation critical against Ukrainian assault. Russian casualties heavy. Russian ammunition nearly gone. Without immediate Russian relief, cannot hold more than 2 hours against Ukrainian forces. Request permission for Russian breakout or surrender to Ukrainians. Russian reply was inflexible. Russian reinforcements en route. Hold at all costs against Ukrainian attack. Surrender to Ukrainian forces is forbidden. At 12:30, Ukrainian forces launched final assault from 3 directions simultaneously. Ukrainian tanks and infantry advancing together, using fire and maneuver to close on Russian positions. Russian defenders fought with what they had left against Ukrainian assault. Russian rifles, few remaining Russian machine gun belts, Russian grenades. Some Russian positions held minutes against Ukrainian attack. Others overrun quickly by Ukrainian forces. Close combat between Russian and Ukrainian forces, desperate, brutal, short. Northern sector against Ukrainian assault penetrated first. 50 Russian soldiers against overwhelming Ukrainian numbers. After 12 minutes, 38 Russian soldiers were dead, 8 Russian wounded, 4 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian forces. Eastern sector against Ukrainian assault held 15 minutes before collapsing. 31 Russian dead, 6 Russian wounded, 3 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops. Western sector against Ukrainian assault fought 18 minutes. 28 Russian dead, 9 Russian wounded, 5 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainians. By 1300 hours, approximately 80 combat-effective Russian soldiers and 50 Russian wounded remained on summit, surrounded on all sides by Ukrainian forces moving in. The Russian colonel gathered remaining Russian officers. His leg wound from earlier Ukrainian artillery bleeding again. Field dressing soaked through. Looking at faces of Russian officers, he saw exhaustion, resignation. All Russian officers understood mathematics. Continued Russian resistance meant everyone died at Ukrainian hands. Russian reinforcements weren't coming in time to save them from Ukrainian forces. At 13:15, Russian colonel made decision. Ordered white flag raised, torn white undershirt tied to radio antenna. Signal of Russian surrender to Ukrainian forces. At 13:18, Ukrainian forces ceased fire on Russian position. At 13:20, the Russian colonel limped out with raised hands toward Ukrainian lines. Behind him came 15 Russian officers and soldiers. A Ukrainian officer, a captain, met them and accepted Russian surrender. Ukrainian terms were simple. Russian forces lay down weapons. Russian wounded would receive medical treatment from Ukrainian medics. All Russian prisoners treated according to conventions. At 13:30, Russian surrender process began. Russian soldiers filed out, placed Russian rifles, machine guns, grenades in piles for Ukrainian forces. 78 combat-effective Russian personnel. 46 Russian wounded. Total Russian prisoners, 124 surrendered to Ukrainian forces. But not all Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainians. Group of 29 Russian soldiers led by a Russian major refused surrender. Barricaded themselves in old concrete foundation, partially underground structure. The Russian major's position was that surrender to Ukrainian forces was forbidden by Russian orders, and they would fight Ukrainian forces to end. Ukrainian forces attempted negotiation with Russian holdouts. Surrender now to Ukrainians, be treated properly, survive this war. The Russian major refused. At 14:15, Ukrainian combat engineers placed explosive charges at entrance to Russian bunker and detonated. Entrance collapsed, sealing 29 Russian soldiers inside. At 14:20, Ukrainian troops breached through rubble and entered Russian bunker. Brief, vicious firefight between Ukrainian and Russian forces in confined space. When ended, all 29 Russian soldiers were dead. Ukrainian losses from final Russian resistance. 4 Ukrainian soldiers killed, 6 Ukrainian wounded in assault on Russian bunker. At 14:30, battle was over. Ukrainian forces controlled position. Final count from Russian assault force. 480 Russian soldiers attacked Ukrainian position at dawn. 327 Russian soldiers died in combat against Ukrainian forces. 29 Russian soldiers died from wounds before or after capture by Ukrainians. 95 Russian soldiers taken prisoner by Ukrainian forces. 29 Russian soldiers missing, likely deserted during Ukrainian assault. All 12 Russian T-72B3 tanks destroyed by Ukrainian forces. All 16 Russian BMP-2 destroyed or captured by Ukrainian forces. All 6 Russian supply trucks destroyed. Both Russian medical vehicles destroyed. Ukrainian forces consolidated on recaptured position. Ukrainian forces had lost 41 killed and 34 wounded defeating Russian assault. 3 Ukrainian tanks destroyed by Russian fire. 2 Ukrainian tanks damaged. 4 Ukrainian BMPs destroyed by Russian fire. 1 Ukrainian BMP damaged. Position remained under Ukrainian control. At 1500 hours, promised Russian reinforcements arrived. Russian battalion of 18 BMPs and 380 men approached from south. Found Ukrainian forces in control. Wreckage of Russian assault force littered slopes. Bodies of Russian soldiers everywhere. Russian relief force commander received orders from Russian command. Do not engage Ukrainian forces. Withdraw to starting positions. There was nothing to relieve. Russian assault force no longer existed. 95 Russian prisoners were processed by Ukrainian forces, interrogated, eventually most were exchanged. The Russian colonel, wounded and captured by Ukrainians, survived. The Russian major and 29 Russian soldiers who refused surrender to Ukrainian forces were buried by Ukrainians in mass grave near foundation where they died. Tactical situation reversed completely from Russian perspective. Position Russia took from Ukraine at dawn was recaptured by Ukrainian forces by mid-afternoon. Russian battalion that captured it was destroyed by Ukrainian counterattack. Russian position gained was lost to Ukrainians. Only lasting result for Russia was 356 Russian soldiers dead. Multiple Russian failures were identified afterward. Russian assault succeeded initially. Position was captured from Ukrainian forces. But then Russian force became fixed on isolated position with limited Russian supplies, surrounded by superior Ukrainian forces, ordered by Russian command to hold regardless of circumstances. Russian order to hold at all costs became Russian order to die at all costs against Ukrainian assault. Ukrainian operation demonstrated excellent planning against Russian forces. Allow Russian forces to take objective, then surround and destroy Russians while they're committed and unable to maneuver. Use Ukrainian artillery to wear down Russian forces, attack Russians from multiple directions simultaneously, offer surrender when Russian resistance becomes pointless to minimize Ukrainian casualties. Numbers told story from Russian perspective. 480 Russian soldiers assaulted Ukrainian position. 63 Russian soldiers survived as wounded prisoners or escapees. 356 Russian soldiers died. 12 Russian tanks lost to Ukrainian forces. 16 Russian BMPs lost. $58,881,000 in calculated Russian losses. But beyond Russian numbers were stories. Russian tank crew that died in initial assault when vehicle was hit by Ukrainian Javelin. Russian soldiers on northern slope who fought overwhelmingly superior Ukrainian forces until killed or captured by Ukrainians. Russian breakout attempt ending with Russian soldiers dying in Ukrainian minefield. Final stand of Russian major and 29 Russian soldiers in concrete bunker against Ukrainian assault that became their tomb. Position had been significant for observation and tactical value over Ukrainian territory. After battle, it gained different significance for Russian forces. Reminder of what happens when Russian forces committed to positions they cannot hold against Ukrainian assault and ordered to fight when fighting cannot succeed against Ukrainian counterattack. Position is still there under Ukrainian control. Ruins of old farms still there. Ukrainian shell craters filled with rain and snow and vegetation. Graves of Russian dead unmarked. Position changed hands and only permanent result was Russian casualties. This is modern warfare in Ukraine's defense against Russian invasion. Tactical objectives become traps for Russian forces, where Russian orders to hold at all costs mean Russian soldiers dying at all costs against Ukrainian forces. Where Ukrainian encirclement is death sentence for Russian troops and Russian surrender, though rational, is sometimes forbidden by Russian command. Battle lasted from 0530 when Russian artillery preparation began until 1430 when last Russian resistance was eliminated by Ukrainian forces. 9 hours total. 7 hours of actual combat after position taken by Russians. 7 hours that killed 356 Russian soldiers and destroyed Russian battalions worth of vehicles and equipment at Ukrainian hands. 7 hours on position that wasn't even particularly important in larger scope of Russian-Ukrainian war. Just one position among thousands. But for 480 Russian soldiers who assaulted Ukrainian position and 356 Russian soldiers who died there fighting Ukrainian forces, it was most important position in world and the last. Welcome to warfare where isolated Russian positions become death traps when Ukrainian forces counterattack, where Russian hold at any cost orders ensure Russian destruction, where Ukrainian encirclement means Russian annihilation, and 7 hours transforms Russian victory into Ukrainian inflicted catastrophe.